Good evening. It's wonderful to see you here. Thank you to everybody who's involved in the invitation. It's wonderful to see Americans and Canadians working so well together and so affectionately together. That's good for the soul. It's also good to be back in America House. I was here once before. It's fitting to be doing what we're doing at America House because it's a living symbol of what I hope is not a vanished era. America House begins in 1945 with what I think many Germans remember as a benign imperial occupation that turned into friendship. And the friendship between Germany and America goes much deeper than politics. It goes to music and rock and roll and movies and poetry and art and literature and people like Lee Miller. So this is a wonderful venue to talk to you. And I want to talk about these subjects for a little while, and then David's going to give me a hard time, and then all of you are going to give me an even harder time when we have questions, and I'm looking forward to that. So let me start. In his theses on history, written before he took his life after failing to escape from Nazi Germany and occupied France, the German writer and theorist Walter Benjamin wrote a text that many of you probably know, which evoked the angel of history. He created a wonderful image, a haunting image of the angel moving backward into the future, watching the ruins of the past pile up behind her. And I wanted to start there because we're in a historical moment, but it's a characteristic of historical moments that we don't have any idea how it's going to turn out. All we can do is walk backwards into the future like the angel of history. We always walk backwards into the future, and we always walk backwards watching the ruins of the past pile up in front of us. And so the only way we can anticipate and prepare for the future, I think, is to look carefully at those ruins, to look carefully at the path that brought us to this moment, and understand the pattern that time begins to assume when we survey it retrospectively. Benjamin, as you know, put the emphasis on the tragic nature of our relation to the past, the fact that the past cannot deliver us predictive certainty about the future. But I would put it, because I'm a Canadian, slightly more optimistically. I do believe, because I'm a professional historian, because I was teaching a history class at 12:30 today, we can understand the past. It's the only tool we have to anticipate the future and avoid the worst that it might bring. We're always facing the wrong way. We're always backing into the future. But all of us tonight, over the last months, have felt the future coming at us like the thunder of a train that we can feel shaking the ground beneath our feet. And that feeling, the future coming at us like a train, is especially strong in revolutionary moments, and we may be living a revolutionary moment. It's a moment filled with rage and fear, and I could join with many others in denunciation, fury, vituperation, sarcasm, irony, but I'm more interested in trying to understand how the hell we got here, because I think that's what we desperately need. We need much more than moral anger or moral distaste. We desperately need to understand the path that brought us to this moment. The conventional answer, of course, about why we're in this moment is that this revolutionary moment begins on a quite specific date, January the 20th, 2025, when the President of the United States swore the oath of office. But I think this is magical thinking. I think pretending that the world has changed just because one country has chosen to elect a destructive trickster as its president is to fail to understand how he got elected in the first place. It's to fail to understand how he stands at the end of a historical process that we desperately need to understand. We need to understand why he was elected, what historical factors made his coming to power possible. And I want to do that for a while, and then bear with me a bit, and then I would like to talk about what Europe and Canada need to do to be up to the historical challenge we face. So then the question for all of us is, when did this moment begin? If it didn't begin in January 20th, 2025, when did it begin? One of the hints that I would have here is that we need to remember something about the president's biography. He's a baby boomer, like me. He was born in 1946. And so the first thing that you know is that his experience, like my experience, was of the unprecedented economic boom that America experienced and Canada experienced after 1945. What the French call les 30 Glorieuses. The first 20, 30 years of his life are the halcyon days of American prosperity and American hegemony. And I think that tells you one crucial thing that is at the base of his political appeal. It's angry nostalgia for a vanished past, for an America that's gone forever. That's the first thing. So it starts in the 60s. What else is going on in the 60s? He comes of age, he's 21 in the 1960s, as I was, and he comes of age in an era of civil rights. Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream, feminism, gay rights, this extraordinary explosion of emancipation that created the world that I, as a liberal, rejoice in. Whatever the hell mistakes liberals made, we got that one right. People in this room are freer. They have better lives as women, as gay men and women, as people of color. They have better lives because of the revolution that unspooled in the 1960s and 70s. But let's be honest to note that that moment of emancipatory change was also the moment of the beginning of a counter-revolution. For every person of color, every gay man and woman, every person emancipated by the 60s, there were Americans, particularly white Americans, who thought, we're going to lose. The American South switched Republican in that period and never came back. And the rebellion against woke begins in the 60s, not in the 2020s. It begins then with a sense that the liberal revolution is threatening to the power, prestige, and privilege of the white majority. And then when liberals began to impose speech codes, political correctness, the right way of thinking about diversity, it made things a lot worse. We've got some thinking to do about the ways in which we turned an emancipatory doctrine into a coercive code of political correctness and made the radical counter-revolution gather steam. The other thing that happens in the 60s we need to remember is it's the era of Vietnam. I marched against the war in Vietnam from the time I entered college till 1973, to Nixon's second inaugural. Thousands, millions of people, Germans, everybody, we all marched. And we need to remember that more than 50,000 Americans never came home. And America lost the war. And so the third element in the Trump ideology is the bitterness and disillusion about endless wars that we keep losing. And it wasn't just disillusion with endless wars, it was disillusion with the liberal internationalist elites that led America into these wars. And so that's another element of the Trump ideology, which we need to trace back to the 1960s and 70s. And another thing we need to add is that it's also the place in which the divide between the MAGA Republicans, the Trump Republicans, and the conservative Republicans begins. Because whatever you think about Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush and George Herbert Walker Bush, they were liberal multilateral internationalists. And they didn't hear what Trump was hearing and parts of the Republican right were hearing, which is, we are tired of being sent off to die, to consolidate imperial hegemony in faraway places, and get our backside shot off while you sit there in Washington and preach liberal internationalism. And so the divide in the Republican Party begins over this issue, the sense of what price young Americans should pay for American hegemony overseas. And then we come to the summer of 1989. You see what I'm doing? I'm leading up to the present. In the summer of 1989, an epical event occurs, which is the Tiananmen Square repression of a demonstration in favor of freedom. And suddenly America, which had thought, we have provided global public goods and globalization in part because we think that this will draw authoritarian communist regimes into the capitalist world, and we will get economic liberalization and political liberalization together. And in June 1989, we all got slapped awake and told, that's not going to happen. But this had a consequence I think we didn't notice, which is that a lot of conservative Americans looked at the ways in which America had funded and supported globalization with free public goods like global navigation, the whole structure of international trade that encouraged China's rise. Part of the reason for doing that would be to liberalize the Chinese regime and draw it into the international order. And instead what happened is all that effort by American foreign policy had ended up creating an extremely substantial, tough, relentless peer competitor. And that, again, unsettles the confidence that American elites have in the ways in which they use globalization to further American interests. And then in the autumn of 1989, the wall comes down, and all of us, I remember it painfully well, were euphoric about the ways in which liberal democracy had triumphed, and Francis Fukuyama told us history was over. And in a Soviet outpost in Dresden, a young KGB agent was busily burning papers and thinking to himself, this is the greatest disaster of the 20th century. While we were celebrating, he was weeping and beginning to plot the revenge that reaches its culmination in 2022. The West doesn't realize that Russia, stripped of its empire, faces an existential challenge of its own, which is to answer the question, what are our frontiers? And they look at an independent Ukraine and remember that Ukraine had been part of the Russian Empire and think we've been amputated. And then if you move forward to 9/11, I'm trying to construct the narrative of historical change over 60 years that allows us to understand the world and the argument that Trump has made so successfully to the American electorate. On 9/11, and I was teaching at Harvard at the time, a superpower is humbled by a mass casualty attack, and Americans discover that this omnipotent deep state that has such fantastic intelligence capabilities did not catch in time the worst mass casualty attack since Pearl Harbor. Does that contribute to disillusion with the American state and with American power? You bet. And when you then go to war for 20 years to stamp out the terrorist threat, and it ends in ignominious defeat in Afghanistan in 22, that consolidates the view that American power is in crisis. And then, because this is Munich, there's the Munich Security Conference of 2007, when that ex-KGB that KGB operative in Dresden is suddenly the president of Russia and begins to say to the West, we do not accept the post-1989 political settlement, and we are going to contest not just, we're going to reassert a new set of borders for our country, don't say we weren't warned, but we're also going to contest unipolar dominance by the American hegemon. And then 2008, suddenly this 30 years of globalization is disrupted by a massive economic crisis. The seizing up of the global economy further weakens confidence in the American state, but it also throws the life chances, possibly of people in this room, into reverse. And suddenly Trump has a constituency of young Americans who feel the promise of the American dream has failed them. And then finally, 2019, we come to that little virus that starts in a Chinese fish and flesh market in Wuhan. It spreads first to the neighborhood, and then it spreads to the city, and then suddenly it spread to the whole world. We have to shut the world down. And again, a tragic irony. This might have been a moment in which we all come out believing in the credibility of science, the capacity of science in incredibly short periods of time to develop life-saving vaccines. We could have come out of it believing that our supposedly fragile, weak liberal states actually rose to the challenge and saved hundreds of thousands of lives by effective quarantine. But in the United States, the effect is to redouble suspicion of science on the one hand and redouble suspicion of the invasive, incompetent, illiberal state. And so these are the ruins that the angel of history sees as she walks backward into the future. And there's one other historical factor that's tremendously important to put into focus. The dawn of the 21st century is the dawn of the internet. It's the dawn of social media. It's the dawn of the cell phone. We have the equivalent of the Library of Alexandria on our phones. And the one politician in the Western world who understands immediately the potential of that technology is Donald Trump. Because he understands it allows him to vault over the gatekeepers, the opinion gatekeepers, which had structured public opinion in Western democracies and in America for my lifetime. It allows him to reach directly into the cerebral cortex of millions of Americans, and it empowers them like the priesthood of old believers. It's like the Gutenberg Revolution again, to create their own truths, their own realities, their own facts. And he's a genius at jumping into that opinion formation and structuring it with a narrative which assembles all the facts I've given into you into a picture of what he calls American carnage. He's a politician entertainer with a genius for understanding the technological possibilities that have been opened up by the 21st century. And he knits together a narrative that pulls all these changes together. It's a new language of a beleaguered hegemon confronting the historic rise of a rival, confronting the irony that free trade globalization that they had championed, that America had championed for 80 years, had caused it to lose primacy in the leading technologies of the new era. And it led to a very clear agenda. America must stop providing free global public goods to the Germans, to the Canadians, to everybody, because these people have used the global public goods and protection provided by the United States to become rivals and competitors. Europe is a competitor. Canada is a competitor. China is a competitor. And the point I want to make is that this language has deep democratic appeal. Free trade has never been popular in the American manufacturing hinterland. We know as Canadians because it was not easy to get the free trade deal done originally. Tremendous domestic resistance in the United States 30, 40 years ago. So, disillusion with free trade, disillusion with endless war, and what this illuminates is something that I don't think has been said enough. There's a very unstable relationship, historically, between American hegemony and American democracy. American citizens are asking, for the first time in a way, and saying the price of hegemony is too high for us. It is taking allies and empowering them to become competitors. Free trade is not working for us. The global goods we provide are a ripoff. And this unstable relationship between hegemony and democracy is, I think, driving us into the future. It is also the case that American democracy is now in crisis. When you pick up your newspapers, it is an open question whether the president will defy court orders from the highest courts in the land, and this will end up in the Supreme Court. So we're at a moment of enormous tension in the viability of one of the oldest democracies in the world. But the point here is that this challenge to liberal democracy mounted by the administration has enormous popular support. That's the point that's important to grasp, not to see this as the kind of crazed behavior of a small coterie of lunatics. The more disturbing fact is that it's anchored in a great cry of anger and fury, much of it manipulated by the American public. There's a wholesale popular uprising against the American constitutional system, which began with the riot to prevent the certification of a free and fair election in 2001, and it's now been followed by a systematic attempt to dismantle the federal government, its programs and services. And in this, he and Musk have a good deal of support. Millions of Americans think the federal government is an enemy of liberty. They think the judiciary is thwarting the will of the majority. They believe Trump when he says he will free America from parasitic allies like Europe and Canada, reshore jobs from overseas, and make America great again. So if this is a coup, a rapidly moving overturning of the checks and balances of the American Constitution, it's a coup, unfortunately, folks, with Democratic support. That's what makes this a genuine moment of crisis, a genuinely revolutionary moment. So we have a unique but by no means unprecedented phenomenon of democracy destroying democracy. The Weimar parallels will surge into every German's mind, but what's interesting is how different this situation is. We're not talking about an economy at 30% unemployment. We're not talking about a country that's just been forced to accept an unjust peace. We're not talking about all the conditions that made the Weimar democracy so fragile. This is happening in the old established liberal democracy on earth. And so I'm trying to find a narrative that begins to assemble why this didn't just suddenly start on the 20th of January 2025. So let me go quickly over what I also want to say, because I don't want to leave you in despair. I want to talk a little bit about what Europe and Canada can do. What's interesting about Europe and Canada is we have the same challenge, we have the same dilemma in ways that I want to spell out a little bit. We need to maintain the viability and legitimacy of our democratic institutions. We need to defend our sovereignty, and we need to rediscover our agency. There's some weird way in which 70 years of dependence on the Americans have left us strangely infantilized, strangely slow to grasp what remains within our power, within our capability. And recovering that sense of agency, that sense that we can do things and do them fast, that psychological work that we have to do inside is tremendously important, because it means we need to form alliances, pool resources, strengthen the capacity for united action. That translates into a very specific thing, creating interoperable defense capabilities with procurement across 27 countries. We need to diversify our export markets to reduce dependency on the American market. We need to listen to Mario Draghi. Draghi is saying to you, Europeans, you can't be a competitive economy in the 21st century unless you have efficient, centralized capital markets. You've got to raise huge amounts of dough if you want to stay in the AI game. And if you have fragmented capital markets, you're not going to get there. You're not going to get there if you have fragmented labor markets. The interesting thing is that's the same problem in Canada, identical problem in Canada. We have fragmented labor markets and fragmented capital markets, and we have got to get rid of them to build one national economy, one capacity to raise large amounts of capital. If we can't do that, we don't have an economic future in the 21st century. We need to strengthen common border protection. We need to get past our ridiculous arguments about migration. We need migration because we have declining populations, but we have to have a simplified, lawful migration stream that opens up pathways to citizenship for some, offering temporary but renewable entry to others, coupled with, and this is the part liberals don't like, but we have to say it, with credible repatriation of illegals. You can't maintain the legitimacy of a democratic system if you don't know who the hell is in the country, right? You can't sustain liberal democracy if you have illegal migration which you no longer control, because it becomes an issue for the public of, do we control our country? Do we control our borders? This is a legitimate question. I'm the son of refugees and immigrants. I couldn't be more in favor of migration. Nobody could. But you can't sustain a migration system without a repatriation system for illegals. Now, what Europe needs to do, Canada needs to do. Common capital and labor markets, break down internal market barriers, tighten up border security, repatriate illegals, reinvest in defense capabilities, and decrease our dependence on the U.S. But probably the most important thing is to get that dependent child out of us that depended so long on our powerful American friends. There's a psychic change in here that I feel very strongly. I spent 15 years in the United States. Let me make it clear. I cede to no one in my affectionate, even love for American life and culture. But it was not good for our psyches to depend so deeply on our neighbor to the south. And now we have to wake up and stand up and take control of our destiny. Thanks so much for listening.